everyone, Amer here with another Mission Impossible episode review. This time I'm reviewing Season 4, Episode 14, which is called The Falcon. It's a three-parter, so technically it's Episodes 14 through 16 of Season 4. So we start this one off with Jim pulling into a drive-in with a big blue convertible this time. Don't know what happened with the big white one he had recently. The mission. General Ramon Sabatini has imprisoned his country's rightful ruler, Prince Stefan, and faked his death in an effort to seize power. The IMF must stop him and rescue Stefan, his fiancée Francesca, and her cousin Nikolai, who is the current ruler, somehow. For the dossiers this time, we get the usual team, of course. Willie gets a nice new picture, which is great, and Tracy joins the crew again. We also get a fellow named Sebastian, who will play a minor role, and a glimpse of a Falcon named Lucifer, who is also part of this mission. In the apartment scene, we see the IMF using a very interesting-looking screen for effect, Paris doing a magic act for real, Tracy with frankly ridiculous hair, I really hope that's a wig, and earrings with radio transmitters for Tracy, and Lucifer looking around the room. So we go to the unnamed country where the IMF gets prepared, including Paris setting up Sebastian with a mask of himself. Sabatini has a discussion with Vargas about the fact that Francesca still refuses to marry him, but he says that a visit to Stefan will change her mind. Vargas urges him to accept the help of an Asian country which has promised support instead of Sabatini's risky plan, but the general says that the Asians will turf them out just as easily as help them. Vargas also laments that Nikolai's childlike whims are costing the country a fortune, but Sabatini says he's just being a worrywart. Jim comes into the palace with a cultural society as a tourist to visit the royal vault, which is allowed by Sabatini, who says he plans to sell the crown jewels as soon as he's able to, and Jim puts a marker on one side of the vault. An interesting note, the guard who takes the tourists into the vault is played by Richard Romanus, who is in the revival series in the episode called The Fixer, which we'll see after a while. Barney and Willie load up Paris's magic equipment, including putting Paris in one box and Barney in another box. We see Prince Nikolai in his room among dozens of ornate clocks, lamenting that one of them is missing a key piece, which makes him super unhappy, so he refuses to sign papers that Sabatini has brought. Sabatini manages to come up with the piece out of his pocket, getting the signature before he turns it over, and Zastro the magician's arrival is announced to Nikolai's delight and Sabatini's minor annoyance. Sabatini takes Francesca downstairs to a waiting car for a visit to Stefan's prison cell. And Francesca is, of course, also very unhappy, beginning to call out to Nikolai for help, but Sabatini warns her that her cousin is not in a position to help her at all, so she stays quiet. Willie brings Zastro's boxes in, and the guards want to inspect them, worrying Barney, who's inside that particular box. Fortunately, Nikolai intervenes and tells the guards to stop bothering Willie and then goes back to looking at his clocks. Jim uses a special camera to continue to scope out the vault and make some invisible marks. Meanwhile, Willie is able to get the boxes into the reception area, and Barney starts quietly removing floor tiles, as Paris is brought in via another box. Actually, I think it's Sebastian. Willie uses a drill to cover up Barney's work of getting through the floor and into the crawl space underneath it. In Stefan's prison cell, he and Francesca discuss their hopeless situation. Stefan tells her that Sabatini will kill him regardless of what happens, so he encourages her to marry Sabatini so at least the people will have some hope in the royal family and the future. Sabatini cuts the visit short and taunts him, saying he'll make sure that Francesca will continue the royal bloodline to Stefan's impotent fury. Tracy as Madame Vinsky arrives with Sebastian as Paris, along with Lucifer for the show, to Nikolai's delight. While Zastro gives Nikolai a preview, Barney uses Jim's mark to position himself, and Jim's first marker attracts Lucifer, who flies in and sets off the floor alarm, allowing Barney to remove a floor tile in the vault, but he has to support it with his back as the guards enter. Paris notices a guard standing right on top of it, and Barney, so he signals Lucifer to fly back towards him to Barney's relief. He's able to get in and swap the jewels for duplicates made by the IMF. Sabatini prepares for the impending wedding, while Willie sets up a trap for the priest's car, causing a blowout, and showing up with a horse-drawn carriage offering to help, but actually making things worse. Barney exits the vault as Vargas comes to get the royal crown and puts the tile back, supported by a jack, as he continues his crawl around the basement or crawl space of the palace. Paris goes to Francesca's window as she lies on her bed crying with her pet cat. He gives her a few items, including a pill and a small pistol with a real bullet plus a blank. Sabatini comes to the room, wanting to see what she's hiding in her hands, forcing Paris to throw a coin at the cat to cause a distraction. Francesca is able to put the things away and replace them with a cameo of Stefan, satisfying Sabatini's curiosity. On his way back to his room, Paris loses his footing and finding himself dangling precariously above one of the guards. Off to part 2, Paris is able to right himself and get back into the room as Barney starts drilling again in another spot, which we later see are the royal tombs. More masks are made. This time it looks like Paris sets himself up with a Nikolai mask, covering it up with a mask of himself. Jim and the tourists come to the tombs, and Barney is able to drop one of the jewels to Jim. As he trudges forward, a beam gives way, and Barney takes a nasty fall, knocking him out. Vargas and Bucaro discuss their own plan, which involves removing Sabatini. He arrives, and Sabatini warns Vargas about trusting the corrupt Bucaro, revealing that he knows that Vargas has his own ambitions. The time for the wedding arrives, but the priest is delayed as Willie takes him on a ride away from the palace until their misunderstanding is cleared up about where the priest wants to go, and they find a guard with a motorcycle to take the priest to the palace. In the meantime, the time has come for Zastro to perform, and Paris complains about the delay, saying he's out of here. But Nikolai begs him to stay and do a show, reminding Sabatini that there won't be a wedding unless he signs the marriage documents, so he's running the show. Zastro's first trick is a disappearing act, where Nikolai enters one booth and is knocked out by Sebastian, and the other booth, Paris sets himself up as Nikolai, effectively switching places. The act continues with Stefan's face appearing in a puff of smoke, and then Tracy appears as Madame Vinsky to do her mind-reading act. Paris as Nikolai writes down a bunch of numbers and hands them to Vargas, which Tracy is able to reveal to the crowd, impressing Vargas. Tracy right at him and says that something unexpected will happen that afternoon, and there is a man, Vargas, but it's not stated explicitly, will have to make many choices. Barney comes to but calls Jim and tells him he can't see properly, wanting to call the plan off, but Jim says he can walk Barney through where to go and how to get there. The priest arrives, Jim signals Tracy, who tells the crowd about it, and it's confirmed by the guards, further impressing Vargas about Tracy's skills. The wedding ceremony begins. Paris as Nikolai sees the gun, trying to wrest it away from Francesca, but in the struggle she is shot and dies. Vargas shows amazement at Tracy's earlier prediction of seeing red on her white dress, and asks her why she didn't try to stop the shooting. And she tells him that she knows that Sabatini's plan is fated to fail. She offers to discuss Vargas's own future in private, angering Sebastian as Zastro, who leaves in a huff without her. Paris, as Nikolai, demands that Francesca be buried immediately, as Jim continues to guide Barney toward her crypt. After the effect of the pill wears off, Francesca awakes and expects to see Barney there to save her, screaming out in vain and struggling to breathe as the candle in her crypt goes out from lack of oxygen. Barney gets there and slowly puts his equipment together, drilling through the side of the tomb so he can pump oxygen in, but there's no way to know for sure whether Francesca is okay. At that point, Barney's vision returns to normal, fortunately, and he drills through the concrete. Francesca fortunately wakes up, weak but alive, and she and Barney make their exit back to the reception hall. Willie begins dismantling all of Zastro's equipment, taking it back to the IMF van. First the box containing the still unconscious Nikolai, then the disappearance booths with Barney and Francesca. Vargas and Sabatini argue about how to continue, with the former saying they must take over by force now. There's no choice. A guard arrives saying someone named Benedict wants to see Sabatini and shows him the jewel that the IMF pilfered earlier. Vargas confirms that all of the crown jewels have been stolen and replaced by clever fakes. Benedict turns out to be Jim, of course, who says that he wants 30% of the take from the jewels, and says that Prince Stefan, if he were alive, could tell him where they are. Jim says that there's an incriminating letter out there which will be made public to the world if anything were to happen to him, and Sabatini makes preparations to take him to the prison. Jim signals Tracy, who places a call to Vargas as they prepare to leave. Tracy warns Vargas to stay at the palace, not go to the prison, come to see her about where the real jewels are. Tracy tells him she'll tell Vargas about the jewels once Sabatini is removed. He cannot trust his Asian backers, and Sabatini will have him killed, so his only chance is to run with the jewels. Paris, as Nikolai, goes to Sabatini's empty office and uses a sound detector to open his safe, while Tracy tells Vargas it contains a list of officers who are to be executed, and Vargas is one of them. After Paris opens the safe, he relays the combination to Tracy, who gives it to Vargas, who confirms the information after Paris adds his name and exits the office. On to part 3, Barney shoots the prison's heater, causing a gas leak to be reported, but cancelled by Willie, who's messed with the phone lines. Jim and Sabatini arrive to confront Stefan about the jewels, with Jim saying he'll drug the information out of him, but Stefan, of course, knows nothing. And Sabatini grows impatient. Vargas calls Sabatini, telling him to come back to the palace right away, tells Bucaro to ready their plan, eliminating both Sabatini and Nikolai. Barney heads to the prison as a gas company tech and gets down to the basement, further sabotaging the phones and then heading towards the elevators, stealthily sneaking past the guards. Once he gets the opportunity, Jim tells the skeptical Stefan about the rescue plan and says it'll cost him nothing to trust him. He tells Stefan just to be quiet until they can get things set, and Stefan agrees. Jim drops another marker as Barney trudges down the elevator shaft near Stefan's cell and starts setting up near it, signaling Jim, and Barney starts to drill at a height that the guards can't see, pushing through a pressure rod from which the special screen is lowered, and Jim puts his briefcase down as an anchor. At the palace, Bucaro sends a clock to Nikolai's room and gives orders that Sabatini be directed there when he arrives. Vargas waits with Tracy, saying his plan is all set, but lets slip that Nikolai will also be taken out, causing Tracy to warn him that he'll be doomed if Nikolai is hurt. Sabatini arrives, heads to Nikolai's room, and Vargas vainly tries to call Bucaro to wait, but it is too late, and Bucaro presses the button. The guards break into the room and find Sabatini badly hurt, with Nikolai also injured. But the mask flakes off, revealing Paris. Vargas and Bucaro arrive at the room, with Tracy listening in. Sabatini shoots them both for their treason, and Tracy rushes back to her room, frantically calls the prison to inform Jim before the guards arrive to nab her too. Jim uses the opportunity to distract the guards and activate the screen, telling Willie to make sure all the phone lines to the prison are cut, as he sets off an alarm and Barney starts to cut through the concrete. Back at the palace, Sabatini puts the IMF's plan together, as Paris and Tracy are held at gunpoint by the guards. Francesca isn't in her tomb. The magic act was a cover for the jewel theft. He wonders to himself, though, about what their motivation is, and then realizes that Jim is still with Stefan. He can't get through to the prison, so decides to go there immediately, despite his injuries. Paris signals to Willie to release Lucifer, while Jim uses lockpicks and thermite to get Stefan out of his shackles. Lucifer attacks one of the guards, and Paris overpowers the other, forcing the one to take them to the prison. As Sabatini takes the elevator down, Stefan's shackle gets stuck to the metal in the shaft underneath it, making it tough for the three to escape, but they do. Sabatini shoots at Jim and Stefan's images in the cell, and the ruse with the screen is discovered. A dejected Sabatini falls dead as Jim, Barney, and Stefan escape into the waiting IMF van, and the royal family is rescued and reunited. Mission accomplished. This being the only 3-part episode of Mission, and there's a lot of footage, obviously, and a lot of action in this episode that needs to be discussed. I'm going to do what I normally don't do, which is to save the grade for the end and kind of talk it out. I know, I'm sure I'm destined to basically come to the same conclusion even after I do that, but whatever. I just think it's better to probably do it that way. Let me start with what is good, and I'm going to talk about some not so good, but a lot of the good was going to have some kind of bad to go with it. So rather than kind of doing it as a full good versus not so good, I'm going to do some also point and counterpoint as I go. First of all, the stuff that is good. This is visually quite an impressive episode. The screenplay of it is really great. The guest stars, I think, are really excellent, especially John Vernon. I mean, I've mentioned before he was in The Exchange last season. He'll be one a season until the very end. and he's always great. Like, this guy was just born to play a villain on television. Just his voice, his mannerisms, his face, just the way he comes across. That's just who he is. Moving on to things that are good but have a counterpoint. So here's a point counterpoint section. And I think I'm probably going to start doing this more often because, the stories are going to kind of become that way, that they're going to require this kind of point counterpoint sort of thing. The first point that I'd like to make about it, the good, is that this is a simple mission. I don't mean by that to say that it's easy in terms of carrying out or anything like that. Or easy in terms of, the IMF is going up against easy opponents. Not necessarily, and certainly not in this case. But it's simple in terms of explaining it to somebody and tracking what's happening is simple to explain. There's 3 members of the royal family, and the IMF basically has to rescue them. And there's one bad guy, and the IMF has to get rid of that bad guy. Simple, right? Not easy, but simple to explain. The counterpoint to that is it does mean that in order to kind of maintain that simplicity and keep the audience kind of, involved in the plot, it means that the royal family really has to be saved one at a time. And that is exactly kind of how the plot goes. First, we're going to take care of this one. Okay, now we've done that. Now let's move on to the second one. Okay, now let's move on to the third one. It's fine. Nothing necessarily wrong with that, but that does kind of necessitate the drag out over 3 episodes. And so, you know what? Good, bad, I can't really say either, but there is a point and a counterpoint to all these things that I'm going to say. We've had a lot of 2-part episodes in Mission Impossible. This is the only third one, the 3-parter, as I've mentioned. And all of those have come into existence because the writers felt that there was too much plot to put into a single episode. And so it gets dragged out over 2. And I've commented that in a lot of those 2-parters, just about all of them, there's a lot of padding because while there may be too much action and plot to fill 1 hour, there's often not enough to fill 2. In this case, we'd have to fill 3, technically. However, I will comment, and I said this earlier in the 2-parter that we had earlier in Season 4 called The Controllers, this one doesn't seem as padded as most multi-part episodes do. It's dragged out, as I said, but that's because the plot is a lot more intricate and involved. There's, 3 people involved, 4 technically if you want to include Sabatini, the 3 royal family and Sabatini. So there's a lot of objectives that the IMF must accomplish. And this time they were able to do it without padding. A counterpoint to that, which is a bit of a negative for the episode, is that because there are so many people involved, there are so many characters involved, that other than John Vernon as Sabatini, and I guess you could argue that Logan Ramsay as Vargas, don't get a lot of screen time. The only other exception might be Noel Harrison as Nikolai, but really he's Paris as Nikolai for most of the episode. So that is a counterpoint. Another issue that kind of goes along with this is that Bucaro, who is played by Jack Donner, from the apartment scene, you would be led to believe that he's one of the major antagonists in this episode, but I don't really feel that it's so. He doesn't get a whole lot of screen time even throughout the 3 episodes. As a matter of fact, I originally recall that he wasn't even in the first 2. He's very briefly in part 2, but really he's only there for some of part 3. With so many characters, it is really, really difficult for the focus to remain in one place. Now, the focus doesn't necessarily have to remain in one place, but again, that can, and I think it does a little bit, give this episode a little bit of a disjointed feel. Yes, there's a lot of action going on, but it can be very, very easy to forget how the plot is all supposed to come together, because sometimes it feels like, okay, we're dealing with this one thing right now, and we'll deal with all that other stuff later, instead of kind of having the action, kind of go in tandem. Maybe that's a little bit unfair, but that's how I felt a couple of times during this episode, where it's like, oh, okay, now we're just kind of like shifting gears and going in this direction now. I don't know, that's just how I felt. Give you an example. Francesca, once she's rescued, she really doesn't have anything to do. She puts on a jumpsuit and she gets into the IMF van and just kind of watches them do the rest of the episode. Stefan is absent for a very long time. Yes, that's integral to the plot, you could argue, but again, he's not there. I don't think he's there at all in part 2, for example. And then in part 3, it really is all about Stefan because the other two have been rescued. Again, maybe necessitated by the plot, maybe I'm making a big deal out of nothing, I don't know, but that is kind of how I felt, that, it might have been nice if there had been a way for the plots to kind of go in tandem. Maybe it just wasn't reality. Speaking of which, it's not even just really the guest stars. I have to give some kudos to the writers to find a creative way to have Leonard Nimoy be on screen. A lot more than I think he ordinarily would in an episode like this. Normally, Paris would have spent the entire episode, most of the episode, as Nikolai. In this case, he's able to get more on-screen time. Leonard Nimoy, that is, the actor, not necessarily the character. This guy Sebastian, who's involved in the mission, essentially has to become Paris, allowing Leonard Nimoy to play that role as well. So that is good. The counterpoint to that is, it took me a little while even to kind of figure out in part 1, because of this whole thing about having Sebastian made up with a Paris mask. I wasn't even really sure for quite some time. Is that Sebastian? Is that Paris? What's going on? And then finally, I had to actually really kind of think about it and say, okay, no. Sebastian is the one who's actually in one of the disappearing booths, and Paris is the one who's actually doing all of the stuff that we see on the screen, during the plot, which is, hanging out with Tracy and, doing the climb and talking to Francesca and all of that sort of thing. That confused me for a bit. And again, like I said, while it's good that they found a way to have Nimoy have more time, it does come at the expense of some confusion. Speaking of poor Sebastian, he doesn't even get to be in the end victory shot. He's not in the van with the IMF. So, did they send him on a separate flight or something like that? Or I don't know what. Did he even get to take off his Paris mask? We don't know. And what happened to Lucifer the Falcon? Was he set free for all of his wonderful work, and now he can just go and, fly the friendly skies? Hope so. That'd be nice, I suppose, for him. But whatever. We just never really get to find out. Also good. This is a Power of 5 episode. Everybody contributes. Everybody has a major contribution to the plot. The bit of the counterpoint to that is that, well, there's so much in this plot. You need 5 people. As a matter of fact, you could argue you needed a 6th in Sebastian, and you also needed an animal in some sense to pull off the plot. So, yeah, I mean, this could be one that you could have called on the Globe Repertory if you wanted to, because you needed some manpower, at some levels, because there was so much to do. Moving on to some of the other stuff, which is kind of a little bit on the strange or not so good side, the ones that I don't really have the counterpoints for. I think it's there's some weirdness that I'd like to touch on. First of all, this royal wedding that Francesca and Sabatini are going to have, this is something that should be attracting international news attention or something like that. Having a magic act as an entertainment for this royal wedding, it does seem kind of weird. It could be passed off as saying, well, that's just, on the whims of Nikolai. Okay, but again, it's just weird. Don't want to dwell on that too much because, again, there's really no point belaboring that point. It's other things that are kind of weird. First of all, I shouldn't say first of all, I've said a lot already. I can't believe that the IMF was able to pull this off in essentially one day. They basically arrive in the morning and they're basically done by about 5 o'clock. That's really amazing. Um, but I guess that's what planning will get you. Another thing that I also found strange, it's not clear to me how this royal family actually works. In the opening with the voice on tape when Jim gets his instructions, we're told that the rightful ruler of the country is Prince Stefan. But right now, Francesca's cousin Nikolai is the ruler because Stefan is presumed dead. I don't know how exactly that could be. I suppose it may presuppose a little bit that this is a country that for some reason doesn't allow women to be rulers. That's possible. It's not explicitly stated. But again, if Francesca is going to marry Stefan, and yet somehow Francesca's cousin is in line for the throne, okay, that's a little bit weird. Maybe is there some cousin marriage involved in this family? Is Francesca somehow a cousin somewhat removed from Stefan or from Nikolai? I don't know. It's possible. It's not stated explicitly. It's just a little bit weird. Anyway, some things I'm going to point out is just kind of not so good in their own right. It was weird to me. Most of this centers around the whole kind of plot against Nikolai. First of all, it seems strange to me that when Nikolai is visited in his office, Paris, who is playing Nikolai at that point, doesn't seem really all upset about his beloved Francesca passing away a few hours ago. I can sort of understand that. The way that the IMF anticipated the plot going was that Sabatini would kind of get offed, and basically Nikolai would just, Paris as Nikolai and Tracy would somehow escape from the palace, and and off they would go, and then they would deal with the rest afterwards. It was just kind of weird that Nikolai just was sitting in his room playing with his clocks again and not really upset about Francesca. That is really, really, really weird to me. The other thing that's not so good is, while Sabatini himself is a very, very capable and competent antagonist, the lameness of Vargas is something that I almost didn't notice it at first. It's necessary to the plot, but it's very, very striking. Vargas believes Tracy's mind-reading capabilities probably a lot more easily than he should. His ambition and his desire for power makes him very, very easy to manipulate. Probably the IMF knew that going in and realized that he was going to be kind of the weak link and kind of the key to making their plot work, and I'm sure they're right, but it needs to be pointed out that that's literally because he's very, very lame as an antagonist. But the real bothersome part of that is the IMF apparently seems unprepared. Tracy seems unprepared for the fact that Vargas would target Nikolai. How in the world would the IMF not have anticipated that? I don't get it. I'm trying to think it through in terms of what the IMF actually intended to happen. I guess what they believed was that Tracy's manipulation of Vargas would cause him to target Sabatini, take him out, and then again, because Vargas is pretty lame, they figured, well, he's going to be very, very easy to deal with, right? He'll make his deal with the Asian people, and then we won't have to worry about it because we'll be long gone. That's what the IMF, I guess, figured. They really needed to get Sabatini out of the way because he was a more competent one. But why wouldn't they think that? It bothers me very much that that they didn't anticipate that risk. Tracy could have said something before, I mean, it might have looked very, very suspicious and said, hey, make sure you don't target Nikolai when you're setting off this bomb. But again, I mean, what exactly did the IMF expect? I don't know. It just really bothered me about that, because it just does not make sense to me at all. Maybe I'm wrong, and maybe somebody can set me straight and say, oh, here's what they were thinking, and it actually does make sense if you look at it this way. And if that's the case, I would really, really love to hear that. So I think I'm going to kind of end on this note. I haven't given it a grade yet. I just realized that. I'm going to give this a grade overall of B. For all the points that I've mentioned. I'm somewhat tempted, after talking about some of the counterpoints, to give it a lower grade. I actually had it up quite a bit higher, just because it really is a good story, and for all the good that I mentioned about it. I've softened on that a little bit because it does have those flaws that I mentioned, so I'm comfortable giving it a B. Could be argued that it deserves a little bit better towards a B+, but I'm comfortable with the B grade. If you think I'm wrong, please, I'd love to hear your comments, and I really would like to hear people's viewpoints about whether I'm on base or off base with regards to my comment about the IMF not anticipating that Paris as Nikolai was going to be targeted. So I'd love to hear your comments. Please like this video, and please subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. It's much appreciated. So I'm going to end this long video, because it is a 3-part episode and there's a lot to discuss. I'm going to end this long video on that note. Thank you all for watching. Much appreciated as always, and I'll see you next time.